Okay, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all, and welcome to a new episode of the Finding Truth podcast. And I am really happy today to have with me Dr. Craig for a comeback to the channel.
Yes.
Welcome back, and thank you very much, sir, for being here. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for the invitation. Good to be with you.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure the first time, and definitely I'm looking forward to this one. Just for our audiences who are not familiar with Dr. Craig, that I suspect is none. So Dr. William Lane Craig is a renowned American Christian philosopher. He is known for popularizing the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God, which was initially formulated by Imam al-Ghazali, who is a renowned Muslim scholar. And Dr. Craig's YouTube channel and website are on the ticker. So I would really recommend people who are looking for great philosophical arguments to look there. I have been personally touched by his arguments for the existence of God, not only the Kalam cosmological argument, but also arguments from Contingency and other arguments, where he would really give somebody, even people who are not very well grounded in philosophy. He is a very charismatic speaker, and he really relays the information through. So he has been also recognized by academicinfluence.com, an organization that ranks academic people as the third most influential philosopher, third most influential theologian, and the 10th most influential philosopher for the last decade. So it's really a pleasure having you here, Dr. Craig.
Thank you.
We are going to discuss today divine aseity. And the word itself is a little, it calls for some explanation. So let's just jump into the topic. What is aseity?
Well, aseity is certainly not an everyday word, is it? Yeah, it derives from the Latin phrase a se, which means by itself or through itself. And the property of aseity is the property of self-existence. And this is ascribed to God as a self-existent being.
Okay, so self-existent is like he needs no other being to provide for his existence.
Right. So there could be possible worlds, and there would be possible worlds in which God alone exists. God is the only existing thing. And so he depends upon nothing for his being. He is simply self-existent.
All right. So often
it might be helpful to distinguish for our listeners, this doesn't mean self-caused. Don't think that this means that God causes himself. That it's more the idea God is simply uncaused. As a self-existent being, he doesn't need any cause.
All right. So it's God exists because he exists. He is existence itself.
Well, now I don't hold to the view that God is existence himself. That is what certain proponents of the doctrine of divine simplicity hold to. And this was a view that was held by Ibn Sina and then also by Thomas Aquinas, and is popular in the among Thomistic philosophers. But I think that this is an incoherent idea that God just is the pure act of being. So that's not a view that I hold, but I do hold to divine aseity, namely that God is a self-existent being.
Great, but we can definitely say that God is the provider of existence to anything else. Would you agree to that statement?
Yes, I would. Now, whether or not that is entailed by divine aseity depends upon how rich a conception of aseity you have. Some have a very minimalist, very thin conception of divine aseity, which would be to say simply that God is self-existent. He doesn't depend upon anything. And in that minimalist sense, there could be a multiplicity of beings that exist a se. This is what many mathematicians believe, for example, about numbers, that numbers and sets and other mathematical entities each exists a se, independently and self-existently. But a richer conception of divine aseity that I have is that this is a unique attribute of God, that God and God alone has the property of existing a se. And that would entail that anything else that exists is not self-existent, but depends upon God for its existence. And then there are theologians, it must be said, who have an extremely rich and robust conception of divine aseity, according to which aseity means that God is not affected by anything else. He is utterly independent, and therefore he is impassible. He determines everything that happens. There is no free will. God is fully independent in that sense. And I fall in between those two extremes in my view of aseity. I think that divine aseity means that God is the sole ultimate reality.
All right. So you talked about independence and dependence. Maybe we need to focus on those terms. So when you say independent, what does this mean? And then when we say that God is independent, how can that take us to the notion that everything else is dependent on him?
Yes.
So maybe someone can imagine that God can be independent, but maybe there are other independent things. How would you take
that would be, as I say, only if you adopt this very minimalist understanding of aseity. But if this is a unique divine property, then it follows that nothing else exists in and of itself. It has to be dependent upon something else. And given that God is the sole ultimate reality, ultimately, all reality, all existence would trace back to God as the first uncaused cause of everything.
Yeah, Greg, you're saying that everything will trace back to God as the first uncaused cause. Yeah.
Right. And that therefore everything else that exists would be caused by God to exist.
Can one take this forward by saying that if there is other independent beings that really exist, that this will put a limitation to God's unlimitedness, and God cannot be unlimited, and if there is other independent beings, then he
I
cannot
think
make
it
a
would.
distinction?
For example, I think that would definitely infringe God's omnipotence, don't you? God's omnipotence is the property of being all powerful. Now, if there are other self-existent beings that are independent of God, then God could not destroy them. He could not annihilate them, and therefore he would not be omnipotent. So I think that the existence of other independent beings or self-existent beings would infringe upon divine omnipotence, which I take to be an essential property of God, so that God would not be God if there were other self-existent beings.
So we can say that God being the ultimate all-powerful being, the necessary being, if there are other independent beings which will make them necessary, then we cannot see the difference. Then eventually they will have to be both limited. And since we're looking for the unlimited, then they will have to be dependent on something else that has caused limits.
Here we get into some real philosophical subtleties. Although they are closely related, I don't think aseity and necessity are the same. Aseity is the property of being self-existent. Being necessary means the property of existing in every possible world. So we could imagine that in every possible world, God creates a certain being. In that case, that being would be necessary in that it exists in every possible world, but it wouldn't exist a se. It would still be dependent upon God for its existence. Similarly, there could be contingent beings that exist a se in the actual world. Imagine there is some sort of a mathematical object, like a set, and it is self-existent and uncreated, and so it exists in that independent way in this world. But suppose that it doesn't exist in other possible worlds. In that case, it would have the peculiar character of being contingent and yet self-existent. And so this, I think, actually magnifies the greatness of God, that God is both self-existent and metaphysically necessary in his being. He not only exists in every possible world, but he is self-existent in every possible world.
You touched on the matter of mathematical sets, and this is an interesting topic. So do you think that abstract things like numbers, like ethical meaning, moral concepts, etc., exist independently from God?
This was a question that I first heard posed way back in 1982 by a philosopher named Thomas Morris at a conference that I attended in Milwaukee. And Morris explained the challenge to divine aseity that is posed by the philosophy of Platonism. Platonism is the view that there are, in a robust sense of the word, things like numbers, sets, propositions, properties, ideas, possible worlds, all of these abstract objects, and they are self-existent and uncreated. And Morris said, this is a tremendous challenge to the existence of God, because if these things exist independently of God, then God is not the sole ultimate reality, is not omnipotent. And so how do you deal with the challenge of Platonism? Well, Morris's own solution was singularly unconvincing. It was that God created all of these abstract objects. And that just didn't seem to make sense, Ahmed, because it runs into a kind of vicious circularity that can be illustrated by considering properties. In order to create the property of being powerful, God would already have to be powerful. If he weren't powerful, how could he create the property of being powerful? But then you see you've got a vicious circularity or a bootstrapping problem. In order to create the property of being powerful, God would already have to have the property of being powerful. And so you can't explain this by saying that God is the creator of all of these things. And so for me, this was honestly the most powerful objection to the existence of God that I had ever heard. The problem of evil paled by comparison with this problem. This was like a dagger in the heart of theism, and I did not know how to resolve it. Well, I just put it on the back burner for many years while I pursued other projects. And then about 20 years ago, I took it off the back burner, put it onto the front burner, and I spent 13 long years studying the challenge posed to divine aseity by Platonism, and finally came to intellectual resolution of this problem. I came to adopt the view called anti-realism, that in fact, abstract objects don't exist. They're just useful fictions that we use in order to calculate and talk about the real world of concrete objects. And so the challenge of Platonism to divine aseity simply evaporates on an anti-realist view. And I was surprised how plausible and robust such an anti-realist perspective on these things is.
Would you in this context, for example, consider something like mercy an abstract object, the very aspect of mercy?
Yes, that would seem to be an abstract object. It's either a property or it's a concept or a value. So if it exists, it would be an abstract object. And I would say that it doesn't exist. What exists are merciful people or merciful persons. So I would say God is merciful, but that doesn't mean that in addition to God, there's this other thing also, mercy, that exists alongside of him. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
You can often get rid of these things by paraphrasing and saying, well, mercy doesn't exist, but merciful persons do.
A reflection that I had on this when I listened to your lectures. So I wanted to see if Islam can resolve this issue. And I found this hadith where it refers to mercy, and that God has made mercy like 100 parts and sent one part to earth and kept 99 to himself. So it told me 2 or 3 things. Number one, that mercy can exist as a concept that God creates, not independent of him, and that he sets its, he sets its dimensions. He sets how merciful can humans become. There is only meaning to mercy when there is free will. So, a table cannot be merciful to a chair.
No.
So mercy itself is dependent on creating creatures that have free will, who can be merciful to each other.
Right.
And then he says, let there be mercy. He is merciful, so let there be mercy among those creatures. And then he establishes this as a value, says, I am merciful, you should be merciful, but I will be many folds more merciful than you anyway, because
that's the way, that's the way I would interpret that, exactly as you just said. Not that God has created some abstract object, mercy, or 100 of these, and one of them he sent down to earth and he kept the other ones somewhere locked in the storehouse. I think that's just a metaphorical way of speaking.
Absolutely.
And expressing what you just said about God is abundantly merciful, and we have finite, limited mercy in our relations.
So what you have said is really exciting, because when I pursued this hadith and looked at what scholars were saying about it, they said exactly the same thing. It doesn't mean that there are 100 pieces. It says that God is so way more merciful than us.
Right.
Because the hadith says this one piece that goes to earth is what makes even an animal, lift its hoof so that it doesn't step on its little offspring. So every creature on earth is using this one piece of mercy. So they're saying this is metaphorical, and it means that God is ultimately merciful. It's giving us this idea. So you would be of the opinion that philosophically, since God is the greatest, there cannot be so much infinite things called abstract things and concepts, and that morality, things are good because God makes them good. God is the absolute, not he is the measurement.
It's funny you should bring this up, because this is the section of my systematic philosophical theology I'm writing that I'm currently working on, the goodness of God. And I'm
Really?
defending the viewpoint that the good is not some sort of Platonic, abstract object other than God. Rather, God is the good. The good is a concrete person, namely God, who is characterized by love and mercy and justice and kindness and fairness and so many other virtues.
Okay, it's so exciting to know that you're writing about this already. And the reflection I have here is that the exact terms that you are using, we have them in Islam under what we call the names of God. So God has
Yes,
99 names in Islam,
yes,
and they are like the merciful, the generous,
yeah,
So
sure.
so generosity is there as something good because God is generous. This is the view, and it is always something very, to me, maybe to others not, but to me, when someone with philosophy and with contemplating can reach something, then finds it affirmed by religion, it's so exciting. So thank you for
I
this.
agree. I think it's very gratifying.
Yeah. So the next question. This is the trick question now. So given we talked about the independence and the dependence, can we, from the aspect of aseity, confirm monotheism as being a necessary conclusion, let's say, and
Yeah.
and how can we do that?
Well, I think that it depends again on whether you adopt a very thin or minimalist view of aseity or whether you have a richer conception. On the minimalist view, as I say, meaning simply self existent, there could be a plurality of self existent beings. But if, as I believe, this is a unique divine attribute, then it does entail monotheism because there's only one self-existent being, one sole ultimate reality, and therefore monotheism would be entailed by God's existing ase.
Great. So all right, so this one, I'm trying to put things together here that people do not typically talk about them together. But since I'm with a philosopher and a theologian in the same time, I'm abusing this opportunity. Okay, so bear this with me. So you're well known for the Kalam cosmological argument, but you also address the contingency argument in many
Yes.
talks I've seen. So just for the audience, contingent means it's more or less goes back to something being dependent or conditional on something, right?
Right. That's right. Yes.
Yeah, and then
It's
to
used
prevent.
in different senses philosophically. A few moments ago, I spoke about things being contingent in the logical sense. It would mean that something exists in a possible world, but not in every possible world. It would be contingent in that sense. But then there's a different sense of contingent that means dependent. And as I said, you could have a being that is necessary in a logical sense. It exists in every logically possible world because God created it in every logically possible world. But it would be contingent in the different sense of being dependent. It would be causally dependent upon God. So the word is ambiguous. And when we use it, we need to clarify the sense in which we mean.
So if we use the contingency argument in terms of the dependence aspect, and we start by things that are dependent that we see in our world, and then to prevent infinite regress, we have at the end to reach the uncontingent, the necessary, the self-sufficient being,
Right.
regardless the temporal aspect now, and then we call him
Yeah.
God. Can we then derive aseity from contingency? From contingency
Oh,
argument, I mean.
I do think that's true, that the contingency argument for the existence of God implies the existence of a metaphysically necessary being, a being that exists in every possible world and that is not dependent upon anything else for its existence, but is the explanatory ultimate. So the way I formulate the argument is like this: everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Premise 2 is that if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. And the third premise is the universe exists. And from those three premises, it follows that the universe has an explanation of its existence, and that that explanation is God, a being who exists simply by a necessity of his own nature. In other words, ase.
Can we combine that with the fact that if this being is limited, then it has to be contingent, and then it has to be limitless? And since it is ase, then there has to be only one unlimited ase being. So it is necessary an ase and single.
I think
Only
this
one.
would depend on what you mean by limited or unlimited. For example, I don't think from divine aseity you can derive all of the other divine attributes. For example, something could exist ase but not be omniscient, or it could exist ase and not be morally perfect. So I think there's a constellation of these divine attributes, or names, as you put it, that God exhibits. And aseity would be one of the most important and foundational, but I don't think that these attributes are all mutually entailing.
What I'm heading to here is that if contingency leads to monotheism, and aseity gives the self-sufficiency aspect, then from both we reach to that God must have the ase aspect and
Yes.
is also one. This is
Non-contingent, right? So metaphysically necessary. But that wouldn't prove, for example, that God is morally perfect, would it?
Yeah, of course, I'm not going there, but
Oh.
we can derive that from other arguments. But at least
Absolutely. I wasn't denying God's moral perfection. Not at all. I was simply saying we do need other arguments.
Yeah. Great. So, okay. So, it also hit me, this thing about the abstract objects, that we have this ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the second surah, when we talk about abstract objects, where I'm not sure if there's something like that in the Bible. You'll definitely know much better. So it talks about God teaching Adam all the names, and then to prove to the angels that this new creature, the human being, is worthy of respect as God's, jewel of creation, because he asks the angels to bow to him. He asks Adam to tell them all the names, and the angels don't know the names, and Adam knows the names. So while listening to lectures about abstract objects, I always had this idea, but it came immediately to the front part of my mind, that God is teaching to Adam something that the angels do not know. So ideas that are abstract, so the angels don't know them, but God knows them. And God teaches Adam those names. And when the angels see that Adam knows the names of the things that they have never seen before, that God maybe shows, they understand that, for example, he tells them, this is a television, and Adam knows this is a television, and they don't. And he understands that the name of the thing means that the thing exists, but the thing's existence relates to Adam. And this explains to the angels that Adam will be innovative, that he will have language, that he will have intellect, that he will invent things that they never saw before.
Yeah.
But regardless that those things do not exist yet, they are abstract ideas that God knows, and they are related to this new creation of his. So God creates Adam, which leads consequently to the creation of the creations that Adam will create, but God knows everything. And
yes.
it goes back to your argument that abstract objects do not exist independently, but they can be ideas in God's mind, and God will
Well,
cause them to manifest or will tell somebody about them even before they exist.
yeah, that's
But they are not independent.
another view. Uh, I expressed earlier, Ahmed, an anti-realist view about these things, but the mainstream Christian position historically is that these things do exist, but as thoughts in the mind of God. They are divine thoughts that God has. And I call this view conceptualism. And that would be another alternative that the theist might adopt to meet the challenge of Platonism. Because obviously, thoughts are contingent, they're contingent upon the thinking mind that has them.
Yes, so actually it takes us exactly to our next question, which is about omniscience. So how do you see that aseity relates to omniscience, and how does this reflect on free will? Let
Yeah.
me expand on that. So God is ase, he is independent. Other things are dependent on him. So for anything to happen, he needs to at least approve of it. And if he approves of everything and he gives everything the sustenance and the power to exist, then somebody might argue that God is responsible for everything that happens,
Yeah.
and that there is no real free will, and that he's even responsible for evil. What would be the philosophical response to that?
Followers of the Protestant reformer John Calvin tend to have this very rich conception of divine aseity, which says that God is so independent of everything that he is not only unaffected by everything else, but that he himself determines everything else. And so this, as you say, I think annihilates free will, which makes nonsense of our moral choices. That means we're not really moral agents, as you said earlier. And I think it makes God ultimately the author of evil, because he is the one that causes people to commit sinful actions. And then to make things worse, he punishes them for those actions that they had to commit, that he made them do. So
Which is a common
agree.
objection from atheists, right?
Pardon me?
It's a common objection from atheists to the argument for God.
Well, I wouldn't put it that way, Ahmed. What I would say is that this is a powerful objection to the theology of John Calvin, which many other Christian theologians have voiced. I myself think that God has given to mankind freedom of the will to make significant moral choices, and that he doesn't determine everything. You remember I said I have a more moderate view of divine aseity, according to which God is the sole ultimate reality. But I don't think that means that God is impassible, that is to say, unaffected by everything else that happens. As a loving being who cares for us, who knows us, who is causally related to us, I think God is affected by what we do. And he's displeased by our sinful acts. And so I think that God is not the sort of all-determining reality. I think that he permits human beings to have significant moral freedom.
Yes, according to Islam, God is displeased when somebody does a sin. So I agree with that completely. And God is pleased when somebody does a good deed. So, and there are very clear ayat that says that God does not like or is not pleased with this or with that person who does this attitude or with this specific act, especially oppression, for example. Very, very, very clear text against oppression and against bypassing or surpassing moral standards, etc. So I totally agree with you. But I'm also excited about what you said, that let's say this, that free will itself can be contingent on God. So if God wills that there will be other free wills, He is omnipotent. He can do it. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And then the wrongdoer is the one who is abusing the free will. And since it is one of the objectives of this world to discern the good from the bad, it all makes sense at the end. Because
Yes,
this is
that's
not
right. And people are
paradise.
held, people are morally culpable for the sinful acts that they freely choose to do. They can't
Yeah.
say, well, the devil made me do it. No, he didn't. You freely yielded to temptation and sin and are culpable.
So us being dependent on God also gives us our free will that he has willed for us to take, which makes us responsible. And even if he knows what we are going to make, it is just because he's omniscient.
Oh,
And it doesn't give us the green card just to be bad because he knew that we are going to be bad, right?
yeah, I agree with that, Ahmed. It's interesting you should raise that. I spent 7 years prior to my work on divine aseity working on the problem of divine foreknowledge and human freedom. And I'm absolutely convinced that these are fully compatible, that even though God has complete foreknowledge of all of our free acts, they are nonetheless free. They're not predetermined or predestined, and that we have the ability to do otherwise. But if we were to do otherwise, then God would have had different foreknowledge. He would have foreknown that instead. And so I think there's no incompatibility between divine foreknowledge of the future and human freedom.
Let me ask you if this parable is a correct one that I like. I explain it to myself like somebody looking into the mirror. And if Ahmed looks into the mirror and he sees that he is handsome or not handsome, it's not the problem of the mirror. The problem is just reflecting my image. And then I imagine that God's knowledge is like a mirror, except that it also sees the future.
Yes.
So if it's the mirror that sees the future, and it sees the future of a being that he has created with volition, with free will, it is just reflecting what the being is doing, just like the mirror is reflecting whether I am handsome or not. It is reflecting whether this or that I am doing. But the mirror, nobody would say that the mirror is making you handsome.
No,
or making
right,
you do this
exactly. That's right.
Yeah.
I think that it's a good analogy. It's a nice analogy. If we can imagine a mirror that shows the future, what we see in the mirror is because that's what is going to happen. It's not that that is going to happen because it's in the mirror.
Because the mirror, yeah.
So I think it's a good analogy.
Yeah. So let me ask you this one now. It's can we derive from Aseity an argument against polytheism, or not?
Well, in a sense, I've addressed that already. It depends on how rich a concept of aseity you have. On this very thin and minimalist view that just means self-existent, you could have a plurality of self-existent things like numbers or sets or functions. And similarly, you could have a plurality of these deities, each of which is self-existent. But in the richer sense that I hold to, where God is uniquely ase, then it rules out polytheism. There can't be any other deities. If there are these gods with a little g, they're just finite created beings that depend moment by moment upon God for their existence, and he could annihilate them in the twinkling of an eye by just unthinking them, and they would disappear.
And then we can safely say that a god with a small g is not a god.
Right, that's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. You got to have a capital G, or we're not talking about God.
That's great. So here's our last one before our reflections part. So in your opinion, maybe you have answered part of that in the last question, but if we define simplicity as God not being unpartitionable.
Mhm.
Can we derive that from Aseity too?
In the sense that a being which is composite would depend upon its parts, aseity would preclude being composed of what you call partitionable or separable parts, because then its existence would be dependent. But I don't think it would exclude um, uh, being composed of inseparable or unpartitionable parts. Those could exist necessarily in God, and therefore would not be incompatible with God's aseity. So I think that a very modest doctrine of divine simplicity could be implied here, but not the very strong doctrine of divine simplicity that most Thomists, well, the Thomists propound today.
So, for example, in Islam, for example, somebody might hear like 99 names, and this would be exactly the response that a Muslim would give. That 99 names, the 99 attributes, does not mean that God is 99 parts. This is the merciful part, and this is the
Right.
powerful part, and this is the knowledgeable
Right.
part. No,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, I would
the
agree with that.
attributes are many, but it doesn't mean the partitioning.
Yeah, I fully agree with that.
All right, so let's go into some reflections now. Dr. Craig, the theologian who is also a philosopher. So in the beginning, we were the philosopher who is also a theologian. So what's your philosophical look when you this what I have on the screen is obviously the Shema, or the very famous listen, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one and unique, or Yahweh is Echad. And I hope I'm translating this properly, but according to the Jewish literature, Echad is one and unique. And it's also very exciting that it's very similar to the word in Arabic, which is Ahad.
Mhm.
So when we look at this, can we see aseity from the aspect of Yahweh is our God, but God in the Shema is the God I'm writing here in capital G is Elohino, and Elohino in Arabic is Rab, is Rabbuna. And Rab means the one who provides, the one who takes care of us, including creating us. So would the part of God is our Lord? It's translated in English, our Lord. I think it's more than that. It's maybe if we look into our Lord as our provider, so we are dependent on Him. So aseity is like center stage in the Judeo-Christian creed. Would that be a true statement? We
Well,
are dependent
I
on
do
God.
think it's at center stage, but not in virtue of the Shema. It seems to me that what the Shema's affirming is the singularity, as it were, of God, that there is only one God, not a multiplicity of gods, but it doesn't itself entail divine aseity or necessity. I think that those attributes have to be deduced from other scriptural passages rather than this one. The emphasis here is simply on, as you put it, uniqueness or singularity.
Okay, so you would see the word Elohino here as just indicating God, not the. Why not also the aspect of it, of the Lord being, if you are the Lord of a county or a place, it means
Yeah.
that you are also providing for your people.
Yeah.
Is it
Right. Well,
is it possible, or I'm pushing it a little
I
bit?
think you're pushing it too hard. I mean, aseity is a metaphysical attribute that is extremely abstract and recondite. And for example, suppose God is the one who is created and cares for and loves Israel. Well, really, in the grand scheme of things, that's pretty tiny. That's just one little country on this one little planet in this vast universe. That's very, very far removed from divine aseity. Even a finite God could be the provider for a particular nation and people group. So I don't mean to minimize this in any way, but I'm just saying that the affirmation of God's uniqueness or singularity doesn't itself entail that this being exists a se.
The reason I'm a little bit biased here, to be honest with you, is the reflection on the Islamic side, because what is very similar to the Shema is Surah al-Ikhlas in the Quran, which it translates to sincerity. So you're sincere to God, and it goes like this: "Qul huwa Allahu ahad, Allahu samad." Say He is Allah, ahad, and ahad is like ihad. It's like one and indivisible and unique. And Allahu Samad, and As-Samad is a very special word. It means, it has two meanings. The first meaning is Asay. Yeah, the one who is independent and everything else is dependent on him. And the second meaning is not hollow, solid or whole, or you cannot partition. So the first verse says that He is one and only, and the second one says that this one is not partitionable, and in the same time He is independent and everything else is dependent on Him. In the same, AlSamad is a very, and I also find it interesting that Asay looks like AlSamad a little bit.
Verbally.
And, and it also looks like an oriental word called Samadi. And the matter that the Shema is directed to Israel doesn't bother me is because as Muslims, and even I think as Christians and Jews, there is a belief that God did not leave everybody else on earth without prophets. So it's just that the prophet that He sends to the Israelites says, "Listen, Israel," but the other prophet He sends, I don't know, to Chinese or to the Indians, will say, "Listen, Indians." So, but the message is the same. God has created you, and He's one and unique, and you should worship Him because He created you, and He is the only one.
Yeah, I think that the more relevant verse here is Genesis 1:1, where it states, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And there you have a transcendent creator of everything that exists other than Himself. I think that's where the transcendence and aseity of God come clearly into view.
Yeah. So this is what As-Samad means, and it's so interesting. So reflections from Christianity, I cannot have the reflections from Christianity having you with me. So in terms of Aseity and Christianity, apart from the philosophical aspect, where do you find it? You've just mentioned, for example, Genesis 1:1. What else in Christianity would be telling Christian believers about God's independence and God's self-sufficiency?
I think that the prologue to the Gospel of John is very significant in this regard. John says, "In the beginning," and here you can see he's reflecting Genesis. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through Him, and without Him, nothing came into being." I think that is a clear statement of God's being the sole ultimate reality through whom everything other than God has come into being. So I spent a good deal of time on those opening lines of the prologue of the Gospel of John, showing their background in Neoplatonic philosophy and particularly their striking resemblance to some of the writings of Philo of Alexandria, the Jewish philosopher who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, who says some very similar things. And so I think those are some of the most important passages in the Bible about divine aseity.
That this matter of the Logos is also an Islamic belief, but it has the name. I listened to you in one of your lectures.
Mm-hmm.
Say when you were describing this prologue, saying the Logos is reason and will or something like that, and in Islam it's like there is the verse that when God wills something, He says to it kun, and kun is like be, fayakun, and it becomes. So He says kun fayakun. Kun fayakun, He says, He orders something to be, and hence it is, or hence it becomes.
Yeah.
And
that's certainly an Old Testament motif, the idea of creation through the word, that God speaks and something comes into being. That is definitely an Old Testament motif that probably is continued in Islam.
I want to ask you this. I watched this very interesting debate that you had. I think it was Roger Penrose.
Yes.
And you had this marvelous argument that relates to this matter of the Word of God. You didn't say it per se, but it will be marvelous if you repeat it here in this context, where I think it was like the universe needs a cause, and there are three alternatives.
Yes.
And then you reach to the point of the alternative the right one has to be God. Can you explain that through this matter of causation?
Yes. Sir Roger Penrose, one of the greatest physicists of all time, thinks very philosophically as well as scientifically. And he believes that reality is divided into three domains. One would be the physical domain, the physical universe that he studies as a cosmologist. But then another realm of reality would be the realm of the mathematical. And this is the abstract realm, the realm of numbers and sets and functions that he works with as a mathematical physicist. But then the third realm would be the realm of the mind. As a thinking great intellectual, he grasps the mathematical world with his mind. And he wonders, what is the relationship between these three aspects or realms of reality? And he said, I don't know how to put them together. I've got these three aspects of reality, but how do they cohere? Well, this is just an example of the ancient philosophical problem of the one and the many. Namely, what is the unifying feature of reality that unites the multiplicity we experience? And so what I suggested to Sir Roger was that if we think of the abstract realm as thoughts of this infinite mind, and the physical as the created product of this infinite mind, then these other two realms can be anchored or grounded in this infinite, uncaused mind, which has created the universe and imbued it with a mathematical structure that makes it amenable to exploration by modern science. And he thanked me afterwards off the air. He said, I've never thought of this before. He said, thank you for giving me something to think about on this.
Yeah, for the audience, it's like the universe has either come from other material things, which doesn't make sense because material is like contingent. So you have to go out of that. And then it may be abstract objects like mathematics, which maybe atheists would go to the laws of physics has created the universe. But then the great argument I like that you said is mathematics is not potent. A mathematical formula will not do anything. It's just an idea.
Right, right.
The
So
real,
the physical and the mental can't depend on the mathematical. The mathematical and the mental can't depend on the physical, but the mathematical and the physical could depend on the mental if there is a supreme omniscient intellect.
yeah. So if we, through the argument from contingency or from the Kalam cosmological argument, we reach to the ultimate creator, then the ultimate creator is not physical and it's not just a mathematical formula. It has to be a mind with volition, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
I
Yeah,
think this was,
praise be to God.
yeah, this was one really marvelous argument. So I thought it would be great that you explain it here to our audience. Dr. Craig, this has been a marvelous conversation as usual. I hope you've enjoyed it.
I have. Thank you.
Maybe we can take some questions. We have like 4 minutes left. What do you think?
Sure, if we got time.
Yeah, let's skim through that. Okay. Somebody's saying, ask Dr. Craig about absolute divine simplicity. We did that, okay, already. There are many people asking about Trinity. Which is okay. So ask about Trinity, ask about Trinity, ask about Trinity.
Did they say what they want to ask about the Trinity?
Okay, so somebody here is saying Dr. Craig is coming closer to Islamic theology with this approach.
No, this is classical theism. I mean, I'm sorry to disappoint Mark, but this is classical Christian theology. There are many elements of commonality between us.
I think what so many people miss in the Islamic, Christian, even Jewish dialogue, they miss the commonalities.
Yeah.
And what I'm really trying on this channel is that Dr. Craig, being a Christian and a great philosopher, can also adopt and popularize the Kalam cosmological argument and help many people with their faith, even Muslims and Jews and other sects of Christianity too. So I think we can, there's so much to learn from each other. And in Islam, on Judgment Day, God will tell us about our differences. And he will resolve the differences. Yeah, so yeah, there are so many questions about the Trinity. I think it will take more than 2 or 3 minutes to talk about that. So maybe that would be another discussion. So Islamic theologian like Imam Ghazali has already solved these problems, i.e. Ash'arite adopt anti-realist view towards abstracta. Yeah, and Dr. Craig is, yeah.
I appreciate Al-Ghazali a great deal. He also rejected the doctrine of divine simplicity that was propagated by Ibn Sina and the other Neoplatonist Islamic philosophers. So I find myself very much in agreement with many of his views.
Yeah.
Did you know, Ahmed, that right off the Temple Square in Jerusalem, there is a Ghazali street?
Oh, really?
Yes. When we were on the Temple Mount the last time, we walked off the end, and there is the street sign, Ghazali Square or Street or something. I was so stunned.
Yeah, you must have been so excited because this is your life excited, right? Yeah. So for everybody here, Dr. Craig is really one of the. I think he is the one who has popularized the Ghazali Kalam cosmological argument in the 70s, I think. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, the last comment?
The popularization of the Kalam cosmological argument was something that you embarked on since the 70s, right?
Yes. It was my doctoral work in philosophy at the University of Birmingham, and has helped to spark a revival of interest in this argument among contemporary philosophers.
Here's somebody who says, William shows great respect, and that is beautiful. And this is his second dialogue here, and it's always very pleasant and enjoyable. Just that's for sure. Okay, so there are so many things, so many people thanking you. Okay, and there are some questions that will take plenty of time to go through, but we are out of time. And this was
well, that's good to leave people hungry for more.
Yes, and I wonder if you would actually like to come back, but you're for sure I will ask you to come back one more time, even more. Thank you, Dr. Craig, very much for this very insightful discussion about aseity and contingency and all the other things that we've gone. I hope that the takeaway for the audience here is that there is so much that we can learn from each other. And I need to thank you again for all the work that you did, that I am sure so many Muslims and so many people who believe in God have benefited from. And I think if you'd like to have a closing statement, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the program today. I love God very much. He's changed my life. My life is dedicated to serving him, and it's a joy to talk about him and be on the program with you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Craig, and thanks for everybody who has been on this show. Please do like and share, and I think there has been so many things that we've gone through that are very beneficial to so many people, whether people in doubt or people in dialogue with atheists or people who would like to have a good connection with between philosophy and theology. And I'll just be putting the extra, and see you in the best of health again, Dr. Craig.
All right. Goodbye.
Goodbye. So